Welcome to week 5, social awareness continued. Last week we started with social awareness and we covered one of the 3 skills, which was empathy. We're going to pick up where we left off last week and talk about the last 2 skills, but let's do our emotional check-in. Um, this is a really useful tool for understanding emotions. Man, I don't remember how to pronounce this. The Plutchik's wheel of emotions. I could spell it and notice it anywhere, but again, when you read but don't say things out loud, there's like this disconnect between sounds and spelling. It's a whole area of linguistics that's interesting. But what is this? What are we looking at right here? It's kind of like a color wheel, but for feelings. And at the center are 8 basic emotions. And I'm going to give you a link in a second. We'll go to the webpage so you'll actually get to zoom in and see this. If you're on a mobile device, you probably can't see what's on it. But I'm going to tell you, at least at the center of it are 8 basic emotions. We've got, I know there's joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. So these aren't just a random 8 emotions. They're core to how we experience and respond to the world. And what's cool about this model is that it shows how emotions can intensify or fade or even combine to form more complex emotions, which I think is probably more on point with how we are as humans. Because, I can be sad and happy at the same time because I've got so many things happening, right? But as an example, if you blend joy and trust, what you get is love. Um, or like if sadness gets more intense, it moves from sadness to grief. So let me take you to the web page real quick, and I'm going to put this link in the chat as well. Let me get there. But if you scroll down, ways down the page, it gives you an interactive wheel to work with. So I think I'm about, I don't know, not even a third of the way, maybe a quarter way down the page. It says click any word to explore. And so you can use this interactive model to learn more about your emotions. So for example, if I pick grief, um, we learn similar words. It'd be like heartbroken, distraught, sensations that come with it, hard to get up. What is grief telling you? Love is lost. How can grief help you to know what we truly want? So I can change the intensity of this. Now, grief's at the center, so it's not going to get more intense, but I can lower it to a medium intensity, in which case that's sadness. And sadness that's even less intense is probably pensiveness, right? So it's helping us kind of scaffold or scale emotions from just one basic emotion, sadness, to like the various types of sadness we can experience within that. So um, now we already talked about a basic list of core emotions before when we looked at Ekman's 6 core emotions, and those were happiness, sadness, fear, anger, surprise, and disgust. And his list was based on facial expressions and like what's universally recognized across cultures. And this model that we're looking at right now builds on that and adds anticipation and trust, plus that deeper look at emotional intensity and combinations. So both are valid. Ekman gives us the basic, and then this model gives us a kind of a richer map. So talking about how to use the wheel just for your check-in today, start by identifying maybe an emotion that you're experiencing and look at the center wheel center of the wheel and think about which emotions are closest to what you're experiencing, and then play with that intensity, right? So I think I'm experiencing rage. Is this really how I'm feeling? Does that match with what I'm feeling? Or maybe it's not rage, maybe it's more like anger. Maybe I'm actually just annoyed. Notice the blends. So, well, we can also explore the opposite of a word. So the opposite of annoyance, I guess, would be apprehension. Um, Now, somewhere here, we should be able to talk about or look at blending emotions together, I guess, in between these pillars. So if I am annoyed and also bored, then I'm contempt, right? So just take a minute to play with the wheel. The link is in the chat. I'll put it in there again in case someone new just joined while I was talking, and use it to see if you can expand some of that emotional vocabulary we've been working on this semester. All right, let's do it. Let's move on. Now, for the record, next week, our emotional check-in, we're going to do one that is like small, breakout rooms oriented, just because the focus is on perspective taking. And I just want you guys to practice some techniques and skills. So it's going to be one of those mock setups where you're in a breakout room with like 5 other people and one person tells a story. And then you have these listening techniques, active listening techniques, and response techniques that you get to practice with. So it's a little hands-on in that way. Super useful. But be prepared for those of you who are like, I didn't want to talk the whole semester. You might have to say something next week, even just in a small group setting. So just to recap, we're wrapping up social awareness today, which is the ability to accurately perceive the emotions, needs, and the concerns of other people, and to understand social dynamics in a given context. What we're focusing on today is the later half of this definition, the social dynamics in a given context. And we talked about I introduced these three key skills last week. We spent the whole time on empathy. We're going to talk about organizational awareness today and service orientation. And I think they're super interesting. I think organizational awareness is especially interesting because I wouldn't innately lock that into a needed skill for emotional intelligence, but it absolutely makes sense. So empathy, again, we covered this last week extensively, but just to kind of refresh your memory, it's sensing others' emotions, understanding their perspectives, and taking an active interest in their concerns. And maybe one of the hardest things about this, maybe you struggle with a certain part of this definition. Maybe it's the understanding their perspective side, or maybe it's the taking an interest in their problem side. We can have different degrees of empathy, and maybe some of this is more natural to us than others, but needed skill. So our second skill that we're going to talk about today is organizational awareness. This is about more than just reading people. So empathy is about kind of like tuning into individuals, how an individual person feels, what that person might need emotionally, how to respond to that individual person, listening to that person. Organizational awareness, though, on the other hand, is about tuning into the whole system. So understanding how a group functions, a workplace functions. My little nugget, my child's behind me. So if you see a little redhead walk by, that's what's happening. Hey, buddy. How does the team work? How does the group work? What's operating beneath the surface? So it's kind of like reading the emotional and political landscape of the organization that you're in. Organization can mean your family unit. It can mean like literally your workplace. We can define that, whatever group you're in. So Goleman specifies, or he like specifically defines this as the ability to read the currents, read the decision networks, and the politics at the organizational level. So picking up on power relationships and kind of those unspoken norms, noticing things like who actually influences decisions here. What's kind of the unspoken culture that's not in the, HR workplace handbook. How do we really communicate? What's valued here? Is it efficiency? Is it collaboration? We could say things all we want about like we value teamwork, right? But maybe that's really not what we're doing in our office, because what's more valuable is hierarchy, right? Or efficiency and people working in silos. So what's actually going on? How are things actually getting done versus what the policy says on how we do things? So just being aware of how things really work in a group. And this is not just by job titles or organizational charts, but by the culture and like the informal networks at play. So just a quick example to think this through. If your office or department, I guess, is anything like mine, we kind of always have these new initiatives, right? Every year we've got this whole new idea of initiatives. We should do this for student retention or recruitment. We introduce these new things all the time. And only some of them actually move forward. And even of those, only some of them actually sustain past a year. But so you're probably not familiar with this concept of like, oh, we got all these new ideas floating around. But imagine you're in a department where you notice like the pattern that the ideas that really gain traction often are the ones that have the support of the administrative assistant. So you decide that before you're going to share your new initiative idea with the whole team, you're going to have a one-on-one with that admin assistant to get their perspective and kind of build their support and build your rapport with them. Because what you recognized about this particular office is that this admin assistant, has a lot of informal influence, even if they're not at the top of the organization chart. You notice that what they like, and maybe they're well equipped for their job, right? But what they like tends to get the most support. Um, or you consider, so that's a good example of reading how things really work in the situation, right? Because that person might not be the ultimate decision maker, but they have some influence in a way that's not like listed in, the organizational structure. You can also consider like the family unit, the department of the family. Even though like one parent sets most of the rules. So my dynamic, my husband's the rule maker, and I'm really not. I'm the fun parent. So like one parent sets the rules and the kids know the other parent is more likely to say yes, because the parent who sets the rules is the no parent and the parent who's like me says yes all the time. So in my case, my kids will wait until, you know, their stepdad's not around and they'll ask me when I'm in a good mood for whatever it is they're thinking, oh, let's get ice cream. And so what's happening here is this isn't the hierarchy of our family. My husband makes great rules. I struggle to enforce them. Like reasonable things like, hey, you can't be on your computer for 8 hours. I think that's a reasonable rule, right? But the kids kind of understand how it works enough that like how decisions are actually getting made. Like, through kind of these unspoken rules, these timing and influence. Okay, if we can get mom by herself and ask her, she'll crack and give it to us. And that's a great example of organizational awareness. Um, it's really about reading the room at a higher level, how the group truly operates. So let's zoom out a little bit though. Every organization, every family unit has its own culture, but so do like entire communities, right? Entire regions and entire countries. So organizational awareness encompasses cultural competency, the ability to, respect and effectively interact with people from diverse cultural backgrounds. And when it comes to emotional intelligence, that includes recognizing how emotions, of course, are expressed differently across different cultures. So things like facial expressions, gesture, tone of voice, eye contact, even when like things like this, or other things to consider, I guess, like so facial expressions and those things, but also like emotions some are considered appropriate or inappropriate to show, depending on the culture you're in, because they don't all mean the same thing everywhere. So a few examples, and then if you have some examples, this is usually a fun topic, I want you to share them as well. But in like many Japanese professional settings, emotional like restraint is really highly valued, especially in a group context. So it's considered really respectful to maintain harmony, which means emotions like anger or frustration are rarely shown openly, right? A calm, neutral expression doesn't mean someone is disengaged or unfeeling. It could actually signal like professionalism and signal like self-control. So if someone from a more emotionally expressive culture, you know, is experiencing this and they're in a room with someone like this, they might interpret that as disinterest, and they're going to maybe misjudge the situation, right? In the United States, smiling often signals friendliness. That's what people say. Oh, they're very approachable, they're very friendly and positive. So even like in casual, brief interactions with strangers, like at a store, walking down the street, the majority of us are really quick to smile, right? Even if we don't know the person. In Russia, however, smiling, especially towards strangers, is often seen as like really superficial, maybe insincere. So you would reserve like the act of smiling for maybe genuine, like when you're genuinely feeling happy, or for like familiar relationships. So um, obviously, smiling is going to be interpreted differently there. So how do we experience smiling then across cultures when these cultures are interacting? I want to take a minute to see if anybody has some examples. I'm checking out the chat too while I'm inviting you to unmute if you have anything you want to add or things you've experienced or other cultural differences like this you're aware of.
I was in Finland on study abroad this summer with some students, and when we had a tour leader, which they stick out my hand and shake their hands, and it was very much like, "Why are you trying to touch me?" So, when I thought it was being kind and approachable, not a thing, not a thing.
That's a great example. Because if you were to reach out your hand here to shake someone's hand, and they intentionally did it, you'd be like, that's rude. That's absolutely rude. Barbara says, I worked at a Japanese company for a long time. I'm also Eastern European. Emotions were not common on the surface at that job. And then in my office, the moment they talk about any visions or ideas of remodeling the David Talbot Hall of Languages, it's an older building on campus. Most of you are familiar with it, but if you're not, it's like the OG library from years ago. And but that topic cannot come up without some of my colleagues going, but the history of the building, and it's very passionate and embodied like emotional conversation. And I think that might I'm used to that. So my colleagues care a lot. Expressing emotion shows you care, at least in the culture of my office and probably in much of like, Northern American culture. So if you're not aware of cultural differences, you're obviously going to misread someone's emotional cues or make inaccurate assumptions. So developing cultural competence helps us kind of avoid those pitfalls and be able to be emotionally intelligent. Um, and it's also a really humorous thing because it's not easy. We have six core emotions that we're saying are universal, but at the same time we're at a roadblock in terms of how we express them in many ways. So let's move on to that third skill, service orientation. So empathy, think of it this way. We got those three skills. Empathy is about understanding how someone feels. Organizational awareness is about understanding group dynamics and systems. And service orientation is about anticipating and anticipating the needs and meeting the needs of others. So, and others, when I say others, that could include, students, teammates, stakeholders you serve, your family. So this skill is about being attuned not just to what people need, but also to what they may not be able to articulate. So responding with practical help and emotional support. You're not just showing up like to solve a problem. You're just showing you're basically helping that person be seen and valued. Um, an example might be like a teacher noticing a student really struggling and not just academically, right, but like emotionally, and therefore offer encouragement or like check in with them privately. Similarly, in a workplace, like an employee might observe a teammate overwhelmed before a deadline and then step in to help complete a task without being asked, right? So this is like where we show up and help take problem solving and making that person feel understood. So in both these cases, though, the individual, is creating value through like that responsiveness and care of the person. So it's beyond noticing emotions. We talked about that with empathy, and we talked about the some with organizational awareness, but this is about that thoughtful action that we apply to it. So it's a proactive, component of social awareness in that case. And it kind of links this idea of perception to action. So this idea of noticing to helping, and we'll talk about that again here in a second. And that's obviously going to set up a foundation for strengthening relationships, and relationship management is our category, or is our domain that we're going to talk about for next week. Let's wrap up this idea of having social awareness, and we're going to have some of our template slides we've been using, asking some of these questions that we've been doing so with each domain. So one of the questions I like to ask is, okay, well, can I have high social awareness? Like, we're on our third domain. We're talking about social awareness. Can I have high awareness of others, but really low self-awareness and low self-management? And this is actually an area where it is possible to be like that, to be highly socially aware, but also not self-aware. So some people are just more naturally attuned to others, picking up on body language and tone of voice, emotional cues, group dynamics, and they're probably great at sensing when someone is upset and knowing how to read the room. So they have high social awareness. At the same time, these same people, they might, not spend a lot of time reflecting on themselves. They might not be aware of their own emotional triggers, their own habits, and actually, because you'd have low self-awareness, you're probably not like aware of your impact on others, right? You're just aware of the feelings of others, but maybe not aware of how they're actually experiencing you. So an example of someone with like low self-awareness but high social awareness, this might be someone who easily notices like their, colleague is stressed out, but they might not realize that their own tone or their own impatience is adding to that colleague's stress, right? Or they may be great at this person, someone with high social awareness but low self-management, low self-awareness might be great at helping others manage conflict, but never really reflect on their own role in like repeated disagreements. So, um, sorry if you heard my husband. Anyways, I don't know if you heard him. Anyways, another aspect of those high in social awareness but low in self-awareness, that you might not know how to protect yourself from like taking on the emotions of others. So, and this is like, might not know how much that empathy is actually impacting your own emotions and carrying those emotions with you without being able to take them off. So ideally we want both. You want self-awareness because it supports social awareness, and you got to understand your own emotions and patterns to be in a better position to understand and support other people. But some of us just have just spent a lot of time developing strong social awareness skills through life experiences, through feedback, even if we haven't done that with self-awareness yet. And I do think of this with homes where it's like parents are very like, don't do that to that person. Do you see how they're upset? Do you see how you did that? You see how you made them feel, and that focus on that. But maybe a home that's not also talking about, well, how is it that you feel? How are your emotions, right? So we're just getting a heavy conversation. We have a home with open conversation about social awareness, but maybe one that doesn't like also do something with self-awareness. So we might have grown to be imbalanced. So, talking about what might cause low social awareness, obviously, some of these ideas are going to be similar to what causes low self management, what causes low um, self awareness. But sometimes people really aren't paying attention to others. So maybe they're distracted or caught up in their own thoughts, and that can make it easy to miss someone's emotional cues that they're putting off, their emotional signals, right? So we're not paying attention to other people. Maybe someone has limited empathy skills, so they're they're really, the challenge really is that it's more about being emotionally in tuned, right? They find it hard to take like perspective taking, putting themselves in someone else's shoes. It might maybe be like difficult to connect with people. So um, now, just to jump down to the last item, some individuals with neurodivergent conditions, so talking about being autistic, so on the autism spectrum, reading social cues or emotional signals is really especially challenging. And so this isn't about someone who lacks care. It's just a completely different way of processing information and interacting with the world, but it comes across as very low in social intelligence, and social awareness specifically is what I mean. So, um, talking about our brains, we have a lot of cognitive biases or assumptions that we make. We make snap judgments about people, about their situations, and we talked about this some when we talked about empathy, things that get in the way of empathy. But we can be blocked from seeing and hearing people, but and seeing what's really going on if we already have assumptions and feel a certain way to that person. Obviously, another thing we talked about last week too was that if you are stressed or emotionally overrun, you don't have anything to give to someone else, right? So you can't tune into other people. All you could do is tune them out because you have to focus on yourself right now. Um, Lack of social experience or practice, right? Social awareness is absolutely a skill. If you haven't had an opportunity to engage in diverse, like social settings, maybe because of isolation when you grew up, maybe even like students gosh, I know so many students here who've never left the state of Texas, right? I think that even if you went to like the Northeast from Texas, you would be hit with culture shock, right? And talk about politeness differences. Politeness is interpreted way different in the Northeast from the South in many ways. So, anyways, but lack of experience obviously is going to make social awareness, you're going to struggle with that at first. You've got to be exposed to be able to learn these things. And as we talked about, social cues, they're not universal. So these cultural differences and being unfamiliar with them, you're navigating a set of norms that you don't fully understand yet when you act with a new culture. So low social awareness doesn't necessarily mean someone's selfish or they're cold. They're just missing key inputs for lots of different reasons. And sometimes it's maybe because they're selfish and maybe because they're cold, but not all the time. We just can't write everyone off that way. The person from Finland wasn't trying to be cold to Brittany. It was just like, wait, what's happening here? It was Finland, right? Okay, thought I was making up a culture, spreading rumors about different things. Um, so, as always, I wanted to talk about what it might look like when someone has low social awareness, right? We talked about what might lead to it, but what does it look like when someone, like, what are the patterns and behaviors we see in someone? How are we experiencing that person? And obviously, you're going to see someone who's missing a lot of social cues. They don't pick up. Oh, there we go. Someone who doesn't pick up on when someone else is uncomfortable or when they're making someone frustrated. They are probably people who misread sarcasm and humor and like don't really notice when the mood and when they've said something that kind of shifts the mood in the room. These people probably also talk over other people and really dominate conversations and interrupting people, holding the floor, like maybe not even realizing that they're taking over the conversation so much that it's shutting other people down. And then they don't even realize when they've annoyed when they've annoyed this group of people, and that these people are like eager to contribute, but now also eager to leave because so and so won't stop talking. um in terms of how a lot of this is going to come across in how they speak. They might say things that are kind of tone deaf or kind of like out of sync with the mood of the group. Insensitive jokes. They can make jokes that are a little tone deaf. uh, and just like that inability to read the room. I feel like we can all think of like that classic character, and like I don't know why I'm thinking like a Will Ferrell movie, but just the one who makes the jokes that you're just like, oh man, don't say that. But like, that's kind of the butt of the thing of the character, right? Yeah, that's the modeling like low social awareness. Um, Obviously going to lack the ability to take perspectives. Appears they're going to be out of touch with like the emotional undercurrent of the group conversation. So they might say the thing that everyone's thinking, that everyone's like, don't say that. Why would you say that out loud? Yes, we were all thinking the boss had a really stupid idea, but you weren't supposed to say it. But they're the person who says it, right? And they're like, what? What was wrong with saying that? Right? That's kind of that attitude that's happening there. Um, all these blind spots, obviously, with someone with low social awareness, is going to erode your trust in them. You're just going to see them as self-focused and like emotionally disconnected, and that's just because they lack emotional intelligence. This person's really struggling to recognize and respond to like an emotional landscape around them. So the kind of interesting thing is like it's kind of a meta moment, right? Because to recognize you have low social awareness in someone else, you yourself need at least a moderate level of social awareness, because social awareness allows you to notice how people interact and like pick up on those mismatches between what's happening in the group and how someone's behaving. So if someone is repeatedly interrupting or talking over or like doesn't adjust to the mood of the group, and you recognize this pattern, you're demonstrating your own ability to read the room, which is like the hallmark of social awareness, right? So recognizing that low self-awareness in others, you have to have some level of it to see how to see that the other person's struggling with it. So it's just a meta moment. um what do you do when you're working with these people though, right? Hopefully you're not this person, but hopefully you're also not having to work with these people. But how do we do that? How do we collaborate? How do we live with people like this? um when if there's an outburst or mood swing or these impulsive responses, it really can be tough. But some practical suggestions, a lot of them mirror the things we talked about with the other skills, but one is to be patient. um, these people haven't developed strong perspective taking skills. It doesn't mean they don't care, it just means they really haven't had the tools or support to grow in this area. And if you are patient, excuse me, and you are modeling gentleness and patience, you can improve their skills by modeling what it is that you want them to do. And it's so funny because this is just like parenting 101, right? A lot of this stuff is like things we do with children. Well, we got to keep doing it as adults. Um, so to that point, like there's this idea that like emotions are contagious. So if you stay calm and grounded, if you stay empathetic, if you shift the tone of the group, like this can indirectly influence other people to regulate themselves better as well. Obviously, don't take it personally. That's really easier said than done. We want to assume that it's about you. They're being mean to me because it's about me. Low low self-management can be tied to brain differences and how I'm sorry, low social awareness can be tied to brain differences and how people process emotions and social cues. So it doesn't excuse bad behavior, but that might help you shift your interpretation to kind of protect your peace. It's not really about you. There's a cognitive thing going on here. Obviously, offer feedback that's supportive, not critical. We'll talk about feedback when we get into relationship management because that's a huge component of effective relationship management. So we'll spend little more time on that next week, but that's obviously going to be useful in this situation as well. Finally, you have to set boundaries. I mean, we can't, at some point, someone that I described on this last slide, um, that person can be pretty wild, right? Like at some point, there's just something unhealthy. It can create an unhealthy workplace. It just really can. Someone with low emotional intelligence. You might have to set boundaries. Um, Perhaps there's something you can establish yourself in your family unit or in your workplace, right? Or, please, if you're in a situation where you need to bring in HR or you need to bring in, another family member to support you, please do that. Because you're also probably seeing that extremely low emotional intelligence, so extremely low self-management, self-awareness, social awareness can also lead into like a really abusive person. Not even just emotionally, but physically, right? Because there's emotion behind that. And there needs to be self-control and stuff there that's not happening. So to go into a more personal note with it, set boundaries, but also be realistic about the scale of the issue and whether or not you need to set some really emergency, like intense boundaries, right? Um, you need to be thinking about that for yourselves. We've just got a little bit left. We're talking about developing social awareness, so the empathy, organizational awareness, and service orientation, but awareness on its own obviously isn't enough. Like the question kind of becomes, what do we do with what we notice in people, right? Um, and so I kind of just want to bridge, like in a small way, to we're going to talk about relationship management next week. So we're going to talk about this idea of communication a lot next week. And you actually were invited to take assessments on active listening, which I'll mention here in a minute. No, I mentioned, yes, you did active listening, you did conflict resolution and communication styles, and most of that we're actually going to look at next week. So if you haven't had a chance to take those assessments yet, go back to those links to do it. But communication is kind of the bridge between social awareness and relationship management. Um, you know, I guess what I want to do right here, right now, is just focus on one aspect of communication because we'll talk about verbal communication and nonverbal communication more in depth next week. One aspect of communication that's really essential, I think, for social awareness is specifically listening, right? Listening with the intent to understand and not just reply. Um, Listening well is what shows people they're seen, shows people they're valued. So emotionally intelligent listening. And again, we'll talk about more in communication next week. Let's just end on listening. It's more than just hearing words. It's like tuning in to both the feelings and the intent behind what someone's saying. And so when we do our emotional check-in next week, that's what we're going to practice is active listening. Um, and research shows that active empathetic listening improves relationship satisfaction and conflict resolution. Huge components of relationship management next week. Now, you were invited to take two assessments. By the way, this is our last week of assessments. So, like, if you did your assessments this last week before class tonight, you are done with assessments. We're finishing the semester with journals and that action report at the end. But you were invited to take two different assessments, a listening skills test and the active listening self-assessment. And they were to give you kind of insight into your own listening habits, like what you do well and what maybe you need to continue to strengthen. Um, so we'll spend a little time reflecting on those this week so we can jump into next week when we talk about how these all come to fruition with relationship management. But if you struggle with active listening, there's some techniques you can think through to help you kind of stay in the moment. One of those is to paraphrase what you heard. So someone's talking at you and you go, "So, Brittany, what I think you just said was dot 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 dot," right? So I'm looking for a way to synthesize it and give it back to Brittany. And sometimes if you're not engaged, that's going to keep you engaged because you're looking for a way to be able to phrase it back. You think intentionally about that, you will stay listening. Trust me. Ask open-ended questions, pull more information from people. That's another way to practice active listening. Withhold judgment while other people are speaking. I mean, it's really easy, to hear someone go into their grievances and jump to like, ah, well, you made your own problems. And then we missed the whole 30 seconds of what they were talking about. Um, Obviously, for good active listening, you have to manage your own emotions first because you need to stay calm and you need to stay constructive, um, even if it's a very challenging topic and it's something maybe you don't agree with, even. So, trying to think if there was anything else. Reflect back. So, mirror back what the speaker says in word and tone. And that's kind of like that paraphrasing listening skill as well. Um, you know, back on the open-ended question things, if you ask like really good open-ended questions, you're creating space for like an even deeper conversation. So active listening is kind of that link between noticing we notice through listening, right? And the action of helping, because we know if someone feels heard, like you are actually listening to them, they feel empowered, they feel valuable. Because nothing's worse than when you're talking to someone and you're like, oh, now my husband's on his phone. He didn't even hear anything I said, right? That's kind of not listening well can have some big consequences too in how you perceive someone and, in the moment of that relationship. So next week, as we step into our final domain, relationship management, we're going to build on this foundation. So we're going to explore listening and speaking and nonverbal cues, how they're going to come together kind of naturally as we talk about things like leadership, navigating conflict, how to influence people, how to have healthy, interpersonal relationships through emotional intelligence. So it's kind of where I want your minds to shift as we're moving forward. How do I listen? How do I communicate? And that is all I had for today. So I'll stick around to hang out and for questions. If you need to take off, feel free. But that concludes social awareness. And I'll see the most of you next week for relationship management.